Next area I'd like to show you is the actual setups available for the recharge process. As I've mentioned before, there's limited setups outside of the recharge module with regard to the actual impact to the users and how they would process transactions, which we will see in a later video. As for the recharge setups, we house all the setups required for recharge within a single module. There's a few touch points on the journal processes where we will have to set up additional types of journals, as well as one or two setups on the legal entities themselves. But other than that, all the recharge setups are held within the recharge module, along with all the processing as well. We'll see a very familiar layout with regard to the actual setup of the module itself. And what we'll focus on right now are the setups available to recharge. Recharge, as explained before, has got a very high level of configuration which is possible, which means we have multiple filters or multiple setups we can apply to certain transaction sets. Now, we can group accounts by a major account category. It's a way that we can group ledger accounts together. We've got the ability to tag transactions with profit centers and with cost centers. These are both familiar to you from a dimension perspective. We've even gone to the point of actually linking these cost centers to standard cost centers from a financial dimension perspective for ease of population. We also then have a source. The source itself would be which region, for instance, the recharge is starting from. It could be US, it could be EU, it could be South America. All of those are possible sources that we could configure in the system. We've then got additional setups we can apply to the allocations called allocated entities. This is a common term which allows us to add any sort of marker to the transaction for specific purposes. We can apply whether it's a net cost or not. We've got different recharge groups. Recharge groups will give you the ability to group certain companies together. That will actually allow you to put common companies for recharge purposes into single categories or single buckets. And along with the posting profiles, we can then utilize the recharge groups in order to drive which account the postings need to go to. Jumping over here to the allocation restrictions. Based on allocation codes, which is the individual allocations of expenses, in other words, from which company to which company and under which of these filters would the allocation codes apply. In addition, we've got the allocation groups, which allows you to group multiple allocation codes together for a single allocation group, which then allows you to split the transactions into various percentages based on the allocation codes. For instance, we could have a look at a headcount allocation. There are multiple allocation codes assigned here, and what we've done for this setup is we've actually assigned an allocation code per legal entity, and in this case for the headcount it has a separate percentage split for each of the legal entities for the related costs in this group. Now the mappings or the routings would have to be in place in order for the process to determine where to actually take the allocation code and what percentage to apply. In addition to the allocation code settings or the mappings on the allocation codes, and I can quickly show you one of these. If, for instance, I go to the mappings of allocation code 461, I can go to the mappings itself, and this is what tells us what to do with the transaction. You will see over here, we'll focus in on the US source. If there's any allocated entity or any cost allocation or any multilateral service agreement, for instance, which is what's currently configured as an allocated entity, and from any source company, anything tagged with this source will automatically route through to company 461. And further to that, we've got setup that determines whether it goes to the third-party customer or to a project, for example, in the company 461. This allocation mapping has been set up to go down to a project level. You would be able to select a customer or a project on each of the individual mappings. Just to look at a separate mapping, for instance, if I go to allocation code 003, we look at the mapping over here, you will see that the US region has two setups in place, which means that if it picks up an allocated entity and the source company, it will utilize this mapping. If it doesn't pick up these specific settings, it will then route through to this company over here. And this company, the example is actually a situation where the cost is held within my same legal entity. In other words, the receiving company is the same cost. And this would be a case where you have costs that are, for instance, 20% held within your same legal entity, and the balance of 80% is then recharged out to other legal entities. Okay, so along with the allocation groups, we have the allocation restrictions. What this tells the system to do, and down to a very specific level, is we can actually link an allocation group to a particular legal entity as well as to a cost center. This allows the system to pick a very specific code automatically if you have set up a unique one-to-one relation. If not, the user will have to select from a list that is predefined on the actual lookup on the transaction, which you will see during the transaction processing. A few other areas here of interest. Recharge allows for markups on transactions, which allows you to actually increase the cost of the recharge down to certain legs in the actual recharge process. This is an ability to actually over recover on your original transaction. We have seen requirements for this, and the postings around that have recently been updated to allow for directing the postings to specific accounts to reflect the markups separate from the cost recovery accounts. We also apply for certain taxes, or we can cater for certain taxes that have been added to the transaction at various levels. By standard, we could default the item sales tax group and the sales tax groups on the various transactions. But in certain situations, you want to drive those to specific tax groups. And the tax matrix allows you to set up on the customer and the vendor related transactions the default tax groups to apply to the recharge transactions at each leg of the actual recharge. So as an example, you would have different taxes applying in the EU region at, for instance, a company level or a country level versus applying from the source company, which is the US region. So US region might have a US sales tax applied to it, and when you're actually recharging across to a country or a company in a country in the EU region, you wouldn't have those same tax codes applying. So this is where the recharge tax matrix comes into play, is that it then overrides whatever was sent through from the original transaction, and it applies the local taxes that are applicable to that transaction. This also caters for withholding tax. Okay, Onward recharging setup allows you to recharge down to a second target company. And what I mean by that is the original recharge process will send the cost down from source through multiple intermediary companies down to your initial target entity. We can then pick up and apply a second allocation group to that transaction that was recharged to the target entity, and then on the next recharge run it will pick that entry up and it will then recharge onto another set of companies. This is applicable to situations, for instance, where you've got a headcount allocation applying transactions down to a particular target entity or target entities, and those transactions then need to be recharged again onto a different set of entities based under a different allocation group.